Thank you very much, everybody. My name's Phil Harris. I work for Decca Games. Decca take games which other companies have abandoned or don't feel that they can run anymore, and we hope to give them a decade more life, if not longer. We support strong gamers and game ethics, and not losing things, maintaining things within the industry. Curt, would you like to speak a little bit about what you do?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. My name is Curt Gervich, and I am a professor in the Center for Earth and Environmental Science at the State University of New York in Plattsburgh, New York, which is about an hour south of Montreal, Quebec. So nowhere near New York City, which is the question that I always get. And I teach classes in sustainability and environmental leadership, and I teach through games, and I create educational games. The thing that I'm most interested in now are escape games and puzzle quests, outdoor escape games that engage us about kind of sustainability in the cities where we live. So,
Trevin.
Hello, I am Trevin York. I first and foremost am a game designer. I've been in the industry for about 15 years, and I spent the first decade of that working on games for social impact, first games for financial capability, and then a little bit of healthcare, and then environment and climate, and here I am. I am the founder and director of Direlark, which is a game design for change studio in Edinburgh in Scotland. I also am a senior fellow at the Adrian Arst Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council, which is such a long name, but they are an organization that is dedicated to disseminating climate resilience, like community resilience in the face of the climate crisis, to 1 billion people worldwide. And they have decided that games and play are an effective tactic to do that work, and that's why I work with them on that. That's why I'm here. Thanks for having me.
And can I start with you, Trevin? What does sustainability, what does the word mean to you?
Thanks. That's a big question. Something that's both, I think I'm going to say this multiple times today, something that's both exciting and terrifying is how broad and yet entangled the concept of sustainability is. And there are all these different facets and buckets and perspectives, and they're all distinct and also related to each other. So for example, we can think of sustainability like the preservation of old media and art and the curation of that, so we don't lose the lessons in the work of the past. We can think about sustainability in terms of the practice of creating digital games, and think about the carbon emissions and the environmental damage caused by the creation and play of games, and how we can reduce that. That's really important. We can think about sustainability in the terms of how the people who make games are worried about the climate crisis or care about environmental sustainability, and thus want to express that through their work and connect with audiences through their work. And that's another facet of this. And there are more, like in terms of community organizing and activism games, and there's all this whole network and constellation. So when we talk about sustainability, we're both talking about all of that, and also sometimes it's useful to get more specific. And I think some of the questions and topics we'll talk about today will be focused on facets of that. But it all is part of that. Sorry.
And Curt, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, when I hear sustainability, I think about resilience, right? It's the idea of enduring over time, and this journey towards reaching aspirations, personal aspirations or community aspirations, and overcoming all the obstacles that are thrown at you as you do that. Maybe they are severe storms and climate change related. Maybe they're economic. Maybe it's about equity. But it's overcoming these challenges as you're on your journey towards, whatever your aspirations may be. So it's about resilience and endurance over time. I think about that in communities, right? So how does a community endure over time and overcome the obstacles that face the places where we live?
And following on from that, how do you feel that sustainability has changed in the views of the global politic at this point in time? Because obviously we see more about global warming. When do you think that sort of change really started to take effect?
Well, there are a few ways that I think you can measure that change. You can measure it politically, and most of our policies or regulations about the environment emerged in the late 60s and early 70s, and have slowly evolved since then. But I think there's been an acceleration in the way we view sustainability recently because more and more people on the planet are being impacted by climate change and the changes that means for us in our daily life, whether it's flooding or wildfires or extreme heat days, ice storms, less snow, whatever those may be. I think there are more people on the planet that are being touched by that, and their lives are impacted, and they're having to adapt. And that has brought a new awakening that is in the last 10 years.
And Trevin?
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess another facet to this is when you look at the conversations in media or in public discourse 20 years ago, there's a lot of conversation around, we need to teach people that the planet is heating or that climate change is happening. We need to teach, if only people knew. Like, this is really important that people know. And a huge shift in those last 20 years has been, now we live in a world where the majority of the people on the planet, as you said, are impacted. We know. That's not the barrier here. The new barrier that research suggests is that people get stuck at what to do next, which is a whole different context and challenge and not to help untangle. But I think it's also a more productive space to work in, because now we can move past just designing interventions or experiences that are just raising awareness and stay very surface level. And now we really get more institutional support to dive deeper and to connect more deeply and to think more critically and to work in that more kind of on the ground, real practical space.
And do you see that institutional support, the linking, which is quite a lot of what you do, Curt, between like games and like institution academia in some ways? Mm-hmm. Do you see that as a big advantage? Yeah, obviously, Trevin, you're saying yes. Curt, do you feel that that's opened up the avenues that you can communicate with people?
Linking, games as a mode for reaching people?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I mean, this audience knows that, games dominate the entertainment industry now, and that there are more game players than there are television watchers and moviegoers, and we generate more revenue from gaming than we do music, TV, and movies, right? And books. So, absolutely. And I think that on the gamer side of that, I don't know, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that gamers are more open or accepting to games that are in the social change space. I think there are gamers that want games that are about social change, and I think that is new in gaming.
Yeah, I think from a game industry perspective, there is an advantage that the game industry currently slightly has over other forms of media in its ability to connect with specific audiences and reach those specific audiences. It's not easy. It's not automatic. You can't just make a game and throw it up without doing any work. Nobody will find it. But because of the ways the economics of storefronts in the game industry work and the way that people are able to find games and download them and play them, there's an ability to make a game for a very specific context or a specific audience and then do the work and reach that audience and connect with exactly the people you meant to connect with in a way that is perhaps easy. Like, Hollywood is not set up to do this whatsoever, right? And that really helps us then use games as an avenue that might be both broad and mass market, but also targeted and specific.
So it's interesting because yes, totally agree, right? But I also think there are forces working against us as gamers, right? So I think that as we make education, I create mostly educational games. Hopefully they don't feel too educational as you play, right? Because I think there's a balance there to be struck, and I want people outside of educational settings to also enjoy them. But as we create educational games and social change games, and we want them broadly distributed in the education sector, at least in the United States, where I'm from, our curriculum is now owned by corporate curriculum creators. And schools buy them, and they implement them like you're cooking a recipe, right? Now we do social studies and we do lessons A, B, C, and there's not time between A, B, and C for a game. It doesn't fit in the curriculum. It's not accepted by the people who said, we're gonna buy this program. And so I think as educational games are becoming more accepted, there's a lot of space for that. There's more freedom and flexibility. There are also these forces that are putting education in a box and restricting our freedom to use games as educational devices.
Yeah, as we were talking about earlier, you see large organizations like Xbox with Minecraft and Minecraft Education, and Epic has a Fortnite education arm, and those are large institutions which are able to develop curriculum and lesson plan from the ground up, and then work with these curriculum organizations and kind of integrate them. But if you're not a massive organization, it can be really tricky to get in there through that avenue. And then you're looking at alternative outside avenues, which are not going to be as direct. And it is useful to have the institutional support of an education system behind and around your lesson plan.
Do you both feel that the trends in sustainability, like wind power, wave power, and things like this, because they're more static than the things that the game industry often deals with, like pirates or dark science fiction and things like this, do you feel that in a way advantages the field because you know how to slowly learn and educate within that field?
Do you want to go first?
So, first, I'm going to push back on your framing as gaming as not being so static, because I think the foundations of gaming are pretty static. People want joy, they want social connection and social interaction, they want to laugh, they want some break from day to day, from routine. And play. And whether or not you're creating games about pirates or superheroes, right? Your games all do that. They fulfill these same core fundamental values that humans need. So I do think there's some static pieces to gaming. Now on the sustainability side, the planetary boundaries don't change, right? The amount of fresh water on the planet is the same and will not change. The ability of the atmosphere to take up carbon, or the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that we need to sustain life, that will not change, right? So these planetary boundaries are completely static. We can change our ability to live in the extremes a little bit with technology, right? Pesticides or geoengineering, things like that. But the boundaries themselves are static. And the second part of sustainability is equity, social equity. And that's fundamental, right? That all people are equal and should be treated equal and should bear the same burden of environmental bads and have the same access to the goods is fundamental and does not change. So there is a lot of staticness to sustainability.
Yeah. We're going to touch on this a little bit more later, but obviously when we talk about the broad reach of the game industry, we're talking about a for-profit industry. And then when we're talking a lot about sustainability, we're talking about maybe non-profit organizations that want to leverage this. So that tension is interesting, and here's some behind-the-scenes info. When I talk to NGOs, and I talk about the power of games, I talk about how adaptable and flexible and quick-moving the game industry is. We chase trends like crazy. And then when a trend dies, we drop that trend like crazy. Look, we're so nimble and adaptable, we can move really fast. And that's really important for them to hear because they do not move fast. They move really slow and they want to move faster. But then when I go the opposite direction, I go, hey, for-profit game industry, here's a potential way to partner with NGOs or nonprofit institutions. The message I use is the opposite. It's, look, this is a space that you can count on being relevant in the future. You're going to make a business bet and you don't have to worry that it's going to disappear before you're done, because making games takes a lot of time and a lot of resources and a lot of money. So both are true, depending on who I'm talking to, but they're both true also all the time. And the last thing I want to just thread through that is I think the core of this is that the people who the reason we're seeing more sustainability messaging and pro-environmental messaging, climate resilience messaging in games is the people who make games care. Games are made by people. People are impacted by climate change. Thus, the people who make games want to express this in their work. And because it's sitting at the core of who the people who make games are, that is why this is not a trend or a fad. This is not driven by someone who owns a company saying you need to chase this trend. It's driven by the very people who make the games.
Do you then feel that the distances between these two separate bodies, are they tightening? Do you see some leeway starting to form between those things? I think, again, at lunch we were talking about games like Civilization, which have global warming functions and things like this, which would never have been there in the things. The impacts of using a nuclear weapon in that game or something like that, or just using coal-fired industry, which warms the oceans. Do you think that there's a growing awareness that these two sides need to work together more tightly?
Yes, and there's still more work to do. So for example, I've talked to studios who were pitching maybe a more pro-environmental kind of game for profit a decade ago. And they would tell me stories about how they would go to maybe government funding bodies or NGOs, and those bodies would go, this is too gamey. This game is too much like a game. We can't fund this. And then they would go to game publishers, and the game publisher would go, this is too environmental. We can't fund this. And a lot of games are caught in that loop. And those same studios will now tell me, they do tell me that is getting a little bit easier because every time a game comes out with pro-environmental or sustainability messaging and it makes its money back, that's all, it doesn't have to be a huge hit, as long as it makes its investment back, it becomes so much easier for the next round of funding. And that evidence is just continuing to build because these games keep getting made or they keep getting pitched because, again, the people who make games care about this. So that is a very positive trend. An area where I don't think, not a negative trend, but it's still a massive gap, is that these different types of institutions, the for-profit game industry and the non-profit sustainability NGO space, speak very different languages and work on very different timelines and are looking for different types of pitches. So it might make a lot of sense to build ground-up community engagement if you're building a game to help a community. And a lot of NGO spaces might really love to see that evidence. Game publishers, if you pitch them a game that's public knowledge, they don't want to talk to you in general. They want to control the release of the game to the public, which makes sense from a business standpoint. It helps them control the marketing and the messaging and the contact with the audience, which is their job. So no one's the bad guy here, but if we're ever able to bridge that gap and more effectively communicate across those worlds, I know there's a lot of potential there because both worlds continue to say they want to figure that out.
Yeah. And Curt, from your side, because you're more in the academia field, do you feel the same?
Yeah, well, I think about this from the other side. There is how do we get sustainability into games, and there's how do we get gamers and game designers contributing to sustainability work. Yeah. And I think there are a lot of skills that gamers and game designers have that make a direct contribution. So gamers and game designers are systems thinkers, right? And sustainability is all about systems thinking. What is in the sustainability world, we call it the social ecological system, this interaction between people and the environment. But you all see systems every day in games. Gamers are world builders and imaginative and create these future scenarios. If we want to achieve sustainability, right, we're thinking about the future. What do we want this planet to look like in 50 years, 80 years, 100 years, 200 years? You all are great at that. You're collaborators, you're integrators. And so I think that the game field, gamers and game designers have a ton to contribute to actually doing the hard work of sustainability. And that's an important connection to make, I think, especially at a university and where there are lots of students so that you see your skills contribute, and we need you in this sustainability movement. So if you ever questioning what's the social value of gaming, it's huge, right? You have a huge platform to change the planet.
I can give a good example, I think, of this phenomenon in action. There's a board game called Daybreak, which you may or may not be familiar. Some of you are familiar with it. If you're not, it's published by CMYK. It's designed by the same people who designed the board game Pandemic. And it's a game about working together around the world to not solve, but to resolve, to improve the climate crisis situation, to reduce carbon emissions, to reach net zero together. And in the process of designing this game, the designers wrote really extensive design diaries, which are publicly, you can Google it, you can read them, and they talk about all the different design processes they went through to try to communicate really complex climate systems in an approachable and engaging way that wasn't misleading, but also wasn't overwhelming. And they have a time lapse of all the different variations of the game board they had, and there were hundreds of variations they went through. But this is a demonstration of using the design process of making games to arrive at an incredibly high quality type of climate communication, which is really hard. And it's a really great example of the process of game design applied towards climate communication, almost, well, not accidentally, they knew what they were doing. And climate communication is hard for everyone, and again, I think we would love to see more game developers and designers who are used to this iterative design process apply those skills to this space, which is work. It's so important.
And I think to add to this from my own field, and just because I can't list everything on my LinkedIn that I've worked on, I worked with the educational game sphere back in the 90s with Longmans, who were a big sort of educational book publisher, and they were trying to get school curriculum things in front of the students. And a lot of these things were verbatim, this is the curriculum, answer the questions on the curriculum and your ship will sail a little closer to the island, rather than sail the ship to the island and learn the things on the island, discover them for yourselves, show the interest that you have in doing it, the act of play rather than the act of just monotonous action. And I talked a lot about breaking down these functions with them at this sort of kernel of educational gaming. And because I mentor a lot as well, I often get people saying, oh, my skills aren't transferable. You, in the games industry, your skills are becoming the most transferable skills across the board. Game models, as Curt was saying, and Trevin has been following on to simulate things and simulate issues and things like this. When I was editing an online magazine called Square Go years ago, I went and talked to somebody doing the effects of climate change in the River Humber, and because it was close to where I was born in Hull, and they were talking very, very much about you could manipulate the model to see how different climate changes were going forwards. And I started talking to them excitedly about gamifying that even more, and they'd said that they had taken it into a museum, and it was the exhibit that kept getting broken by people because too many people were playing it because they wanted to play about with that and they wanted to discover and analyze these actions. So your skills are really, really powerful here at this point in time. And I just closed down the subject, and now I need to start it up again. Trevin, because you were actually the one who's done more games and the designer, but Curt, I obviously feel that you've got input here. Do you find that broad concepts tend to engage more in this sphere, or do you feel that you should curate the experiences more to certain subjects?
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is unfortunately not simple. So in addition to your question about which is more effective, right, there's also the question of which can you get funding for? And that tension is always ever present, because if you, in theory, want to make your money back, you want as broad an audience as possible. And that can feel like it's in tension with designing for a specific audience and context. Because we do find with a lot of climate communication work and climate intervention work and climate resilience building that context is incredibly important. That designing for a specific audience in mind in every sense, not just this is their age and this is where they live, but this is their socioeconomic status, this is their social status, this is what environmental factors they're worried about. The more specific you get, the more you're able to directly intervene in a positive way and a not negative way. So the first part of this answer would be, oh yeah, more specific is more effective. But then the second part is broader gets you better funding. So the third part is, actually, interestingly, the best mix seems to be a broad scaffold with room for different specific variations underneath it. I will try to give an example that's one step outside. It's outside the game industry, but I think it illustrates it pretty well. So Puerto Rico, as you may know, was hit by 2 hurricanes in quick succession a few years ago, and it was devastating. The whole island lost power for at least a month. Regions of the island lost electricity for 11 months. And in the face of that, now, much of the island is solar powered. And the gap, like the difference in energy resilience between before the hurricanes and now is massive. The whole society is transformed. And researchers have tried to trace how that happened and why that happened and how it was so effective. And they found that it was the combination of this big new imaginary in the wake of the hurricanes that said it is possible to transform the island. It is possible to build resilience so this never happens again if we build solar infrastructure. There was that big vision. But then every community found its own way to do that. So some communities said, oh, the businesses had enough money to get solar power, so the businesses got solar power, and the money they saved on energy, they used to fund neighbors. Other communities said, you know what, none of us can afford it, but we can get one solar installation that 4 houses share. And now we all have some resilience. Another community said, we're gonna solar power our water systems so that we have safe water forever. Every community found their own different specific way to go. So the whole island has transformed, but not in the same way, but toward a same end. That's a really specific example that I think does directly translate to how I and we can think about designing games and play experiences that work in this space, where you're able to have a broad vision for the future, but you're actually able to leave room for play, for experimentation, for different paths. Games are so equipped to do this. Games already do this. Really great games give us many different ways to solve the one goal or the set of goals in front of us. That's the approach that I think is now best. That's the conclusion I've arrived at thus far.
It's a great question, and I don't really have. In 2014, I created a game. I was going to say I don't really have an answer, but now I'll have an answer. 2014, I created a game for the Environmental Protection Agency, which is, in the United States, our federal agency that manages or oversees human health and the environment. And the game was called Toxic Release, which now seems like a game about farting. And so it's a terrible name. But the Toxic Release Inventory is an office within the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Toxic Release Inventory is essentially a database of the most toxic chemicals at industrial facilities around the US. And the regulation that this little office implements is about how these chemicals get transported around the country. Totally legal, right? They're transported in trucks with, tanker trucks and things like that. So this isn't releases into the environment, but they're traveling on roads and on railroads and by boat. And the Toxic Release Inventory Office wanted a game that would teach people about this program. EPA has about 70,000 employees in the United States. This office had 32. And they're spread in offices all across the country. So they rarely get to see each other. They talk on the phone, and Zoom and things. But they're a tiny little office. Nobody knows what they do. And they wanted a game that would help people understand what this little team of 32 does, because it's really important. So we created a game, and the game had some industry. It was a role-play game, in-person role-play. And there were 3 teams, an industry team, a local government team, and a kind of community team. And they would role-play, and then they had some cards they could play to each other that did different things. And the cards were all structured. They had things on them that, so that the community team could start a petition and could play that card. Or they could, go and protest at City Hall, or go talk at a city council meeting or something. And what we learned quickly in that as people were playing, they wanted the freedom to work outside the bounds of what typically happens in these conflict scenarios. And what they wanted were blank cards that they could write on themselves and create their own new strategies for interaction. And that was a big learning point for me in that, number one, the game was too structured, and that there's a lot of creativity in the community that needs to be able to come out. So we started creating then mechanisms within the game that would do that. So I don't know, like there's a balance between structure and freedom in a game.
And following on from that, do you feel that games or the systems that you use to educate in certain ways sustainability, do you think that they should have the bitter, dark outcome as well as like the good outcome, that people learn more by being able to destroy as much as they can create?
The game that got me into educational and sustainability gaming is a game that generally ends in destruction. And that was a game I played in college called Fish Banks. It gets played here on campus. And so there's a soft spot in my heart for destruction in sustainability spaces and what that teaches. So I think, players should have agency over the outcome. I think there is a lot to be learned from games that end in disastrous outcomes, though.
Mm-hmm.
Managing tone is such a huge part of creative direction in the game production process and the game development process. And I'm saying that, I think, because that's the framing I use for this discussion, this specific discussion in my head. There's not, obviously, there's no one right way to make a game. There's no one right game. And the tone, the choice you have in tone can vary all the way from deeply depressing to extremely optimistic. And that is a design and development and creative choice. I think where sometimes we see teams and games get into trouble is that either they don't decide on the tone they want to have and they end up with a tone they didn't expect, or they are reaching for a tone and they don't quite make it there. This is part of the craft of making games. We get better at this over time and experience. I had some conversations with the Daybreak folks, and they were talking to me about how deeply they thought about tone and how they narrowed in on their goal of a tone as the game went on, because they realized they wanted to not sit in the depressing we're doomed space at all. That isn't the message they wanted to impart. They didn't want to sit in the super optimistic space, both because they thought that was dishonest and also because players would bounce off of that and go, this doesn't feel real at all. They settled very specifically in what they called grounded optimism. They wanted players to feel the entire time that this was really hard and complicated and a little bit scary, but also possible to improve. And by being that focused on their tone, they were able to, by all accounts, successfully impart that feeling on their players. So my take is less of a yes or no, or is this good or bad, but more know what you're aiming for, and then do the work to reach it. And then that can be really valuable.
And you've both already mentioned games. Are there any other games you feel really, really fit in this sustainability space at this point in time?
I think one that I think about a lot is Terra Nil. And the reason I think, if you're not familiar with Terra Nil, you can play it on Netflix, I think. It's a game about, what's the word?
Rewilding.
Rewilding,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
About rewilding.
It's great.
And you're reintroducing an ecosystem into a space that was otherwise barren. And I got to talk, Sam Alfred, who led that project, has a great GDC talk, which I think is freely and publicly available now, which I invite you to check out. And I've also gotten the chance to talk to him about his process. And what I really like about this example is that they took on this genre of like a city builder. And they also had all these interesting, all this research and reading and care about rewilding that they wanted to express in this game. And they found that they had to deconstruct their genre all the way down. They couldn't make a city builder about rewilding because the mechanics of city building were at odds with the themes that they were trying to express. And so they had to really think hard about every aspect of a city builder at its core elements so they could re-piece them together into a way where their expression was interwoven with the very mechanics of play. And Sam said repeatedly, like, he wasn't trying to make a message game, he wasn't trying to impart a specific, there's no pop-up saying this is how you need to think or feel. He wanted to make the part of the game that was fun rewilding. He wanted to make the very things he was interested in and his team cared about the fun. And I think they did a really great job, so I like bring it up both as a game that is really easy to play and is really accessible to play for a lot of audiences, but also as a great example of how exciting it can be if you give yourself and have the resources and time to really deconstruct and reconstruct back up for your purposes. I think that's really exciting work.
Mm-hmm.
So, for the past year, I've been at the Stockholm Resilience Center, which I'm on a sabbatical for my home institution. And so I've been at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and I'm studying urban escape games, so outdoor games, urban environment, escape game style, puzzles and quests and scavenger hunting kinds of things. And over the past 10 months, I've played 25 games in 9 different countries. And I'm really following 2 companies that I think are doing amazing work. So one of them is called Mystery City Games, and they've got 13 games all around Europe. And the way Mystery City works is you reserve your spot on a website. They give you a secret location where you go and you pick up a backpack. Backpack is full of maps and gadgets that they've created, like laser printed, 3D printer kind of stuff. And a map, and then a narrative device. Usually it's a journal that you've like uncovered, some hidden character from history. You then navigate the city solving puzzles that are embedded in the environment around you. And the best example I can give is in London. In 1853, London experienced one of the worst cholera outbreaks in history. There's a book about this called Ghost Map. And there was a priest and a doctor working, not together, but at the same time, to figure out what was happening in the cholera outbreak. And they both, in their different ways, honed in on one pump, a water pump in the Soho neighborhood. It still exists, you can go and see it. It's a monument now. And, there was fecal stuff seeping into the well, and then it's getting people sick, and they're getting cholera, etc. So the game, you walk the footsteps of Jon Snow, not Game of Thrones. Jon Snow was the doctor who's navigating this problem in 1853. You walk in the footsteps of Jon Snow and in other characters who are dying and who are trying to understand what's happening, living in Soho at the time. As you walk, you're walking in 2024, and you're reading about 1853, and you're reading about death and disease, and some of the buildings still exist, the pump is there, and you can't help but see the resilience of a city that has grown and changed and evolved over 200 some years, right? And so I think that urban escape model really can help you see some of the elements of sustainability that I'm after as an urban planner. The second company I'm following is called Questo. It's an app on your phone, but they create urban escape games. The puzzles and the riddles are kind of, your phone leads you through them with a little narrative, and then you're looking around the environment around you. It's not augmented reality, it's kind of app assisted. But they have made their game making platform open source, so anyone can create games. What that means is that people are creating games about their own little neighborhoods and their own little stories that would never get created otherwise. And so I played a game in the Gabertella neighborhood in Rome. This is a neighborhood that in World War II was a resistance neighborhood. It was a Jewish neighborhood, and they were resisting the war. And their mode of resistance was graffiti. The graffiti's all still there, and there's been a 80-year tradition of more graffiti ever since. So there's current graffiti that's protest art, there's old stuff, and the game leads you through appreciating that. So I think Questo is great in this kind of resilience and sustainability space too, because it gives anyone the chance to create about their own place and tell their own stories of resilience.
And I think in a more like mainstream environment, we see issues of sustainability featured in a lot of games out there. Just aren't. Recently, you start off in a desert with ships just lying in the desert to like climb this mountain and discover something, and it was massively emotionally impactful for me. Season, A Journal for the Future, again, it's talking about these issues, but it's not directly putting them in your face. It's just allowing you to think and breathe and like understand what's going on in the world around us, and how much we can like act and like impact on that, and how much we can like change it ourselves, which I think is a good thing. I've got a couple more questions and then we'll open up to the floor. Should these games be altruistic or can they make a financial profit?
I've worked a little bit with Glenn, who's a co-founder of Sea Monster in South Africa, Sea Monster Games. And he talks a lot about the flywheel, getting the flywheel moving of games for impact. And what he's talking about is this idea that if you want an altruistic game to have an impact that lasts over time, it needs to bring in revenue to pay for the staff needed to run it. That's one of the most sustainable models that can exist if you can get it right. And the challenge is it requires a team that is both equipped to be effectively altruistic, effectively reach their intent for positive impact, and a team that can also at the same time effectively design an engaging game that captures attention over a long time, and a team that has business development expertise. And business development expertise is, there are game studios that don't have that. So getting all of those expertises together is a challenge, but also can be really, can lead towards this sort of successful path. There's a game I've been working on that has been live for almost a decade now. It's not sustainability, it's for financial education, but I think it's a good example of this model. It's called Bite of Reality, and it is played by students around the United States, and they go through this sort of like digitally augmented LARP where they pretend to be adults, and then they go bankrupt and they learn that that's bad. And we do pre and post surveys on every single player, and we're constantly measuring the impact we're having. But the point of this is, it generates enough revenue to have run for almost a decade. If we had just released it for free, it would have died within months. And so finding the intersection of what organizations in the world might have some investment in keeping this going, it's a financial investment for them, then we can kind of redirect those resources to keep this altruism moving. So this game specifically is sold, licensed to different community banks and credit unions. So a community bank or credit union will say, we want to sponsor this game for the communities around us. So a community bank, someone in Connecticut will go, we want the people of Connecticut to play this game, so we will pay for Connecticut to have this game. And then in Connecticut, people play the game and they also build a relationship with this community bank. But then as a result of collecting all of this revenue from all these different communities, who are also adapting them for their own specific circumstances, we're able, again, to pay the staff to run this thing and constantly update it and renew it. It's a hard model to put off, but I think I want to express that it's possible. It is possible to find an intersection between these things and get something started that lasts.
I think our journey to sustainability has to be three things. It's got to be accessible to everybody, it's got to be sexy, and it's got to be profitable.
No, that's cool. That's a really, really good answer. And I think one of the other things I'd like to say before I open it up is that it's really important that if you are looking in the sustainability field and you find something that you're really, really interested in representing, make sure you talk to the groups who have been involved or impacted by those things. It's so, so important, and those groups will almost always bend over backwards to help you and provide you with information and provide you with positive resources to help you tell their story, because they want their story to be heard. I'd like to thank Trevin and Curt
Thank you.
for this
Thank
panel. If you could give them a round of applause, and then we're open to Q&A. Any questions? Yes.
Should I use a microphone?
Yell loudly and then repeat.
Yeah,
We can repeat.
yeah, we can repeat.
So how do you think game experiences can translate into actions you take in your life to make more better climate decisions, for example, if it's taking the bus or buying more sustainable products?
Yeah, so the question was how can games be designed to impact the behaviors in the physical world? Is that the question?
Yeah, so experiences in the game affect your actions.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It's also a really big question, and the answer, unfortunately, again, is complicated because it differentiates depending on who you're trying to impact and what you're trying to impact about them and what the context they're living in is and what type of game you're making, which is a lot of different facets. But there's also a lot of really exciting work happening in this space. There's the Transformational Framework by Sabrina Solba, which I think is really wonderful, out of Shell Games and Carnegie Mellon, which has a nice breakdown of their approach to designing. Specifically, when they use the word transformational games, they're talking about games that leave an impact that lasts beyond the end of the gameplay experience. So changing an attitude or a behavior or a way of being or a way of living. There's also the frame of building what we call imaginaries. Can we build a sense that a future is possible, and can we build that belief that that future is possible amongst a community so that collectively people are working towards a new type of goal? It's another way we can potentially work and use games to demonstrate, show, and have people live that imaginary and then ask them to move it out. I think there's a game in development right now called Out and About. It's being developed by Yaldi Games in Edinburgh, and they have a really interesting breakdown where they're building a game about foraging in your community, so which is really tied to local food systems, and if you can teach communities to forage, then their grocery bills lower, right? Because you can gain access to food that is for everyone that's naturally made. And then, so in the game, you are learning to identify real plants, and you are learning where those plants are in the world and their habitats, and you're learning what season they're in. So they're teaching you practical skills, but then they're also modeling in the game what it means to connect with a community of people who are doing this, what it means to go to farmers markets and local markets. And then they're building a bridge directly so that players who play this game and are positively modeling these behaviors in the game can then find very similar organizations in their own local community. So kind of they're practicing in the digital world, and then the bridge is just keep doing what you're doing, but in your own physical space, which I think is a really nice example of that kind of tactic where you're kind of connecting dots, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I would just add to that, right? Our individual behaviors are important. We should all live as sustainably as we can. But the notion that our individual behaviors are what is going to create a sustainable planet is a distraction and a ruse that was, ruse? Is that the right word? Yeah. Am I saying that right? Right? That was created by big corporations in order to distract us from the things that they were doing, right? So government, industry have created these structures that push and pull and take away our free will. We're pawns in a system, and we have a little bit of agency to change our behaviors here and there. We can recycle more, we can change our eating habits, but really that affects very little. The real change needs to be the breaking down of those structures, the breaking down of these economic structures and political structures that remove our free will so that we can actually move the needle on sustainability more. I'm interested in games that teach us how to do that. So that's skill building games, games that help us see systems, games that help us see what's behind the curtain of politics, behind the curtain of our economy, so that we can eliminate or destroy or abolish those structures and make real change. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but
I was taught when I was young, be the change you want to see in the world. And I think if you are telling a story through like a product or a game or whatever, you are starting to identify the change you want to see in the world, the things that you want to see people do around you. And even if a game affects you, so you make a change in your lifestyle, you maybe start to walk more, or you start to cycle more, or things like that, because you've realized that you've not been observing the world around you. That's going to change other people's attitudes to you and like the way that they react to you. So I think even the smallest thing can have a big
absolutely, absolutely. And we should do all those things that we can. Yes, I don't discount them at all. But we need societal level change.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in games that create that.
I think a quick way to connect the dot is, so I completely agree with everything you just said. And I think this is why sometimes you'll hear us talk about making games for climate resilience rather than for climate mitigation. They are entangled, but if you're aiming to positively intervene in a community, it's much more effective and useful and maybe morally correct to say this is how you can be better equipped to survive the context you're in, rather than it's on you to save the world, which is not how this is going to work. There are nice like if you can make a community more climate resilient in many ways, sometimes it becomes more sustainable in other avenues as well. But when we're looking at direct interventions, we're really helping. We're focused on empowerment and not about making someone less environmentally damaging. Because as you say, it's about systems and big systems and governments and organizations.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yes.
As a game designer who cares a lot for climate justice, whether I develop games about sustainability or not, what would be my biggest responsibility when developing my game?
As a gamer who designs around climate justice, what would be the most important factor when designing your game? Is that
whether you're working with sustainability in your game or not, like how do you make sure your game doesn't make a negative impact rather than a positive one?
Yeah. Three things really quickly. One is just, do the research that you can, obviously be informed about the context and have a specific context, because if the context is too big, then you're never going to be able to, I don't know everything, but when I work on a project, I try to learn as much about that really specific project, and it can really help equip you to understand the context you're moving in. The second one is obviously talk to the people that are in that specific context you're now focused in. Which is, for many obvious reasons, really important, and keep them in the loop and engage them in the development process so that you so you have that feedback loop so you can know ahead of time whether your impact is in the direction you intend or not. And then my third thing is the thing I thought of first, and now I've forgotten it. I'll come back to you.
So I think you're going to make great games about sustainability. And if your games aren't about sustainability, I think you're going to do it sustainably because you know what to do, right? You've studied this, you talk about it, you read about it, you're in the movement. So I have full faith that you'll create great games about sustainability and you'll do it in a sustainable way. I think an important thing to do is to talk about your games to others in a way that shows that your contribution is a credible, serious contribution with social value, and to say that to people, so that gaming as part of the sustainability movement is viewed as a force for good and as a powerful force, and that your games have relevance, right? I talk about them to others in a way that makes them real and relevant and credible.
And I think to finish this point, and something that the panel intimated to me when we were having lunch today, we'd really, really like to come back in years in the future and see more games about sustainability out on the show floor, talking about these subjects and addressing them in different ways. I'd yet again like to thank the panel for taking part in this. We're all available to talk. Just come and chat to us. I'd be really, really happy to if you've got any questions following this. And thanks to the GGC for inviting us and bringing us along.